Today I'm going to show you how to forge a basic cooking fork. This is the long-handled fork that was part of the basic colonial cookware set for cooking in front of a fireplace or over an open fire. I'm going to be using 3/8 square bar to make this fork. I use 3/8 a lot for this type of thing because it forges out just as easily as 3/8 round, but there's a surprising amount more material to work with. So it's great for projects like this where you have to move around a fair amount of metal. The first thing that I'm going to be doing is flattening out the bar slightly. I just want a little bit wider than thicker, and just gives me a better surface to start the split. And here I'm just using the last part of the heat to set up my chisel line. It's really important to take your time doing this split, because if it doesn't go straight down the center, then your tines are going to be misshapen and unequal lengths, and you're going to create a lot of work for yourself. So it really pays to take your time, make sure that it's as centered as you possibly can make it. Here I'm setting up a pair of dividers to measure the length of the cut. I'm not using the ruler directly just because I want to be working in the center of the anvil, and I find it easier to use dividers than trying to measure off the middle of the ruler. And then once I have the length marked out, I'm just going to reinforce the rest of the line so there's no question where the chisel's going when I'm ready to do the actual split. And again, this is a square face chisel, so I'm just driving it right through the work, right down to the anvil. There's no cutting edge on this chisel, so there's no way that it can damage the anvil. And then to finish the cut, you just use the chisel to shear out that thin slug that's left at the bottom of the split. Once the bar is split open, use the chisel to spread the tines out slightly and then forge them out so that they're roughly 90 degrees to each other. You don't need to spread them out any further at this point. Once you have the tines open to 90 degrees, check the inside edge of the cut. If it's really rough or ragged, then use a grinder or a file to clean up the sharp edges. If it's fairly regular, then you can forge out anything that's remaining so you can go ahead to the next heat. You just want to make sure that there aren't any ragged edges or sharp corners that can fold over on themselves and create a cold shut that could catch a cleaning rag or your hand later on. First thing you have to do when you're forging out the tines is to clean up that irregular cross section that was left from splitting the bar. So to do that, you have to stand that cross section up on that sharp edge and then drive it back into the main body of the bar. And then once that sharp edge is pushed back into the bar and you have a regular squarish shape, you can go ahead and round off the corners and start shaping the final dimensions of the tines. If you leave that sharp corner, the tines are going to have a tendency to twist on you because you don't have a good bearing surface for forging a clean edge, and that's going to make it a lot harder to get a nice looking fork. So you really have to get that shape into something that's roughly square, and then you can work from there and create whatever it is you're after. Now, this is the part of the process that isn't complicated, but it's really hard to explain, and you probably won't understand what I'm trying to tell you until you actually go out and try it. What I need to do is actually quite simple. I just want the tines to come out 90 degrees from the handle on each side of the handle. The problem is if I try to forge that T-shaped section by simply bending the tines around and hammering them back into the handle's actually going to cut off the tines because it's going to forge a very thin area right where the handle meets the tines. So what I'm doing here is not bending the tines, I'm actually forging them around that corner. I'm hammering right at the base of that V notch and forging the tines to go around the corner. And the difference is the thickness of the material for the tines isn't changing. I'm actually creating a rounded corner at the base of the handle and the tines, and that's allowing it to maintain the same thickness right around the corner. So during this whole process, I'm not actually hammering the tines out. I'm concentrating on the base of that V notch, and I'm opening up that V into a straight section. And that's doing a combination of upsetting the bar and flaring the bar. And that's going to give me what I need to be able to forge a fork that has solid tines that aren't going to break. So again, it's not a complicated process. You just have to have a really good understanding of what you're doing and what you're trying to move, and then take a number of heats to get that shape right. It's not a quick process, but it really looks good when it's done. So at this point you may be wondering what's going on, because it may not look like much has changed, but it actually has. I no longer have a sharp V where the two tines meet. That area has been transformed into a graceful curve, and you can actually see how the tines are starting to move around the corner. And at this point I can very easily shape that area into the flat T-shaped section that I'm looking for. Now that I have the transitional area from the handle to the tines the way I want it, I'm going to take a few minutes to just draw out the tines and thin out the shape slightly. Here I'm creating a detail that was quite common with these forks. I'm hammering in an offset right behind the area where the tines meet the handle. That way when I shape the tines, it's going to look like it's one continuous bar that's just kind of stuck on the end of the handle. And then once I have that area established, I can finish squaring off the end of the bar. At this point I'm going to take a break from forging the tines to finish the rest of the handle. There isn't really any point in finishing the fork off at this time, because when I'm forging the handle, quite often the tines get whipped around and you have to come back and reshape them anyway. So right now I am just starting the initial shape of the tines, and that also gets them out of the way of the fire so I can get a good heat on the handle without burning the tines. So now I'm back working on the handle, and that pretty much involves just some pretty straightforward forging. I'm not going to be getting too elaborate with the handle. The point of this video was really to show you how to forge the tines. So I'm just extending that offset between the tines and the handle into a flat area that was quite common with these forks. And then I'm just going to hammer out some pretty simple transitions between the different sections of the handle. Here I'm forging in a transition that I'm going to use to create a round bar section that was quite commonly inserted between the fork end of the tool and the actual handle end. In this example you can see the advantage of forging this shape from a square bar rather than a flat bar. Here you can see that I have the round section forged to shape, but the flat section isn't forged yet. Because this started off as a square bar, there's very little difference between the size of the two shapes. So I can define the round section very easily without damaging the shoulders of that flat section because they're not there yet. So when I'm ready, all I need to do is forge out the mass of that square section into the flat section that I need, and the shoulders will naturally develop and transition into that round section of the handle. In this heat, I'm hammering in the offsets that are going to create the transition from the round bar back into the flat bar for the handle. And I'm going to be using the same technique that I just used to create the transition into the flat section for the fork. And then once I have that transition defined, I'm going to be able to go back and finish that round bar section between the fork end and the handle end. When you're forging a shape like this, it's important to keep track of where everything's going. You know, it's pretty easy while you're hammering this round section to have the flat of the handle start veering off from the flat of the fork. So, you know, you could have something that's maybe 30 degrees off or something. So you want to correct that before you do your final forging so it doesn't appear to have any kind of a twist in that shape. And here again you can see how hammering that square section back into a flat section creates that subtle transition between the round and the flat. And in the flat section of the handle, it's just a matter of hammering the shape flat down in the center of the anvil. I'm not using the corner of the anvil here because I don't want the handle to get much longer. I want it to get wider, so I'm trying to minimize the amount that I'm drawing it down. I'm getting ready to cut the fork off of the main bar, and before I do, I'm going to finish shaping the actual fork, and that allows me to use the length of the bar as a pair of tongs, so it really simplifies the forging. And this part of the process isn't really very complicated, it's just a matter of hammering out the shape that looks good to you. I'm doing a more traditional shape here, but you can do whatever you like. Again, take your time and look at it from a lot of different angles to make sure the tines are even and well proportioned. So here I have the fork cut off of the bar and I'm ready to just forge out the rest of the handle. Again, I'm not getting too carried away here. It's just a pretty straightforward fork, two flat sections with a round in between and pretty straight lines, nothing really too elaborate going on. Last offset that I'm hammering in is going to transition the flat section of the handle into a rounded flat section that's going to have a hole punched in the middle of it. So this heat is basically just sectioning off the materials that I need for that. The end of the bar is going to be hammered out into a large flat washer shape, and to do that I need to get rid of the sharp corners on the bar so that it transitions more easily into that round disc shape. Once I have that preformed, I can go ahead and punch and drift the hole. I'm after a fairly large hole here, so I'm going to start by driving in a rectangular square-faced punch, and then I'm going to drift that hole round. Once I have the rectangular hole punched in, I'm going to be drifting it round. Now that I have the hole in place, I'm going to forge down the end of the bar to make a very even ring right around the whole cross section. Even if you take your time and do the best job that you can to get that hole right, there's always a little bit of extra material there that needs to be shaped out before you can continue. And I actually prefer that because if you try to cut it too close, it's very easy to create a thin area right there that's really hard to deal with. So I'd rather forge out the excess to where I want it. Here I'm just cleaning up the transition between the handle and the end of the bar. And then once I have that the way I want it, I'm going to flatten everything out to their final dimensions. And then the handle gets finished off by cleaning up any distortion that happened to the center of the hole from hammering that section flat. And as always, the final step of the process is just to go over everything and make sure it all lines up and looks good. Hi, I'm Dennis and thanks for watching. As most of you know, for the past few years I've been producing YouTube videos on